So good evening, everybody. Um, so at the end of class today, I do want to answer any questions that people might have about um, any coursework we have coming up. Um, for those, I think I answered everybody, but we did not have class last week. It was one of our off weeks. And so if you missed it, you're all good. And what else was I going to cover? Oh, as far as due dates go, I thought I cleared all the due dates, so there wasn't anything on there, but then some of you are saying that you're seeing my July dates on there. So all work is due April 30th. Um, and I know a few of you have asked for like more intermittent, like kind of deadlines. I would try, for intermittent, we're about halfway through right now. So being about halfway through the modules is a pretty good pacing. Um, I know some people like to catch up on spring break. Some people want to take spring break off. So whatever works for you. Um, none of the modules have to be done before or after the classes that we have on them. It really is down to if you prefer to do and have the background knowledge and then come into talk, or if you prefer to hear it and then go in and do your deeper dives afterwards. Um, so this week we are covering topics around developing our students through instructional strategies and through other things around instruction within the classroom. So up until now, we've been talking a lot about identification, about the social emotional needs of the students, like kind of who they are. And so this is when we kind of start to turn a little bit and talk more about what do we do with them. So framing it as understanding who our students are is critically important, because if we introduce the strategies without really giving a sense of how wide ranged the needs and strengths of all of our twice exceptional kids are, it starts to feel like we might be trying to, like throw spaghetti at a wall and see what sticks. And in some ways we kind of are, but it's really because the diversity of needs of all of our students. And so once we kind of get an idea of the breadth of the needs, it starts to make more sense why we have so much spaghetti we're tossing at the wall, because in fact we're not really just randomly tossing things up there, but rather as we talk through the different types of strategies, it becomes that application piece, like, oh, I get this strategy, it's going to work really well for kids with this profile. I see this strategy, it's going to work really well for kids with this profile. So they all kind of pull into that twice exceptionality. But it helps understand why there's so many different strategies. And then when we start to talk a little bit about what makes them all similar and what brings them all together. I'm going to try and work in some other new stuff today. I actually was at the county special ed meeting today, and we got really deeply into this concept of specially designed instruction. Those of you who are special ed teachers, I know have heard this very frequently. And I'm going to try and kind of use that language in some of the work that I'm presenting today. But if it feels a little stilted, it's because even though I know the term and I've used the term, I haven't really included it in instruction before, so work with me. And so with that, I want to talk first about the kind of different ways that we want to talk about approaching instruction for our students. And in the modules, one of the first things that you look at is talent development and a talent pool, and what does that really mean? And I think understanding what and how to develop a talent pool is really important, because that is when, early on I said that I do differentiate between the ideas of um, advanced learners and gifted learners. Advanced learners are learners who need to be in advanced courses. They need the access to advanced material, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're gifted. And likewise, gifted kids aren't gifted everywhere, so they don't always need that high level instruction in every single subject, but if they don't get it in the appropriate subject, then it's going to be a struggle for them. So when we're talking about the talent development pool, in that situation, we're looking at kids who may or may not be gifted, but with the right support, they will show either gifts or talents in certain instructional areas. So when we're thinking about the two students that we're really targeting for that, those are our students who maybe they're not going to know how to be in that advanced class right off the bat. They might not have some of those more natural skills that we might anticipate, but with the right support and with the right um, instruction and the right pieces around that, they can develop those talents and become stronger students in the class. That's not necessarily saying, put all kids in honors and then figure it out. I'm very much not a believer in that, because just like everybody has their needs, advanced learners have advanced needs and different needs, gifted learners have different needs. And so if we try to force everybody into the same pathway, and we try to force everybody into the same pace, it's not going to work. So I do think that, the need for striated instruction and all is very important, but we're really talking about students who, with the appropriate support, are appropriately placed in those different levels of classes. And very much like when we have students who maybe are performing below grade level and we support them to be on grade level, there are students who, with support, can be above grade level, because that's where that support and instruction would get them to. There's a lot of work out there right now on talent development and development pools. There's school-wide enrichment models. And really what all of these are talking about is ways to bring that accelerated, enriched, and talent development instruction to large groups of students, not necessarily speaking on the specific topics that we talk about. We also look a little bit about primary talent development. And primary talent development is really about infusing enrichment into our youngest learners. And for MCPS, we specifically are looking at students who are in Title I schools, because it is more likely that those students have not had the access to some of the more enriching and non-academic activities that parents tend to provide for their students. So, when your kids are young, you might put them in camp, you might put them in music, and just all sorts of different things that are out there for our youngest learners. But all of those, outside of public school, cost money, and there's not a lot of public funding for pre-K, let alone also like those enrichment activities for K2. And so one thing that my office does is we fund a position called the Primary Talent Development Coach, or rather, I'm sorry, Title I funds that. We support the instruction and professional learning for those positions. And what they are positions in those Title I schools that work on language development, divergent thinking, critical thinking, creative thinking, and just make it a way for our youngest learners to have that access to that primary talent development opportunities. And you guys have that information in the modules to read more about. It is a little bit of a frustration, I'll say, that the state of Maryland, while we have it, and the primary talent development curriculum is actually available for, I believe it's either K through third or pre-K through third. MCPS, we cover K2 within the classrooms in those Title I schools, although it's available to anybody. What I think is a little frustrating is that the information and the resources haven't been updated in probably a decade. And, things are moving, things are changing, the skills are still there. But it is something that, we put out there, and I'd really like to see the state put more emphasis and time into, because we know that providing that talent development, those opportunities for learning that are non-academic at that very early age, go and have a huge impact on our students. Because when we start to look at some of the gifted identification measures we're looking at critical thinking, divergent thinking, just all those different things that are non-academic thinking. And this is a really good way to develop it. I am hoping, I'm still trying to kind of work out some timing. I'm hoping we're going to have somebody who specializes in talent development, and especially primary talent development, come in and speak to us. Not quite there yet, so I'm kind of holding off. And if she's not able to come in, I will cover some more of her materials in the classroom. But what I like with some of that work is that, again, it's not geared towards our gifted kids. And it's not geared towards our special education kids, but because it is non-academically focused and it's some of those more interesting skills, it's meant for all of our students so that they can develop those talents. And oftentimes, this is a great way for us to find maybe a twice exceptional student who is struggling in a lot of areas, but really, really does well when it comes to the those primary talent development activities. So one thing I want to do, and I do have this on our site, I'm going to share it right now with everybody, and that is a specific definition for accelerated versus enriched instruction, because there is a difference. And being in the accelerated enriched instruction office, you often hear us all say it in one giant breath. Um, I think the other reason that it's important to talk about it is because during and post-pandemic, there was a lot of talk about academic acceleration. And what we quickly learned from our office was that when we talked about academic acceleration, what was really being talked about was accelerating students learning to catch up to where they should be. So it was not acceleration in the way we actually have it defined in policy. So when we talk about acceleration, we are talking about moving at a faster pace. Just like stepping on your accelerator moves your car at a faster pace, we are talking about stepping on the academic or instructional accelerator and moving the material at a more rapid pace. This does not necessarily mean grade advancement. A lot of times when, especially parents, when we want to talk about, accelerating our kids, and they're like, oh yeah, I want them in the next grade level. It doesn't necessarily mean the next grade level. We also want to be very careful, even in elementary, when we talk about grade advancement versus course advancement, because course advancement is much easier. That's saying we're going to skip second grade math and go to third grade math, or we're going to skip, this doesn't happen as much, we're going to skip fourth grade ELA and go straight to fifth grade ELA. That that is course acceleration. Grade acceleration is when we say, we believe that this student has the overall well-roundedness, maturity, academic need, whatever, to be fully accelerated up to the next grade. So they are different things. They all fall in the same family of acceleration. And we do also know that research shows us that when we're dealing with gifted kids especially, accelerating them is the first best approach when they need something differentiated for their learning. But again, that does not necessarily mean grade advancement or course advancement. It means moving through the material faster. And so what that could look like is when we talk about things like curriculum compacting. And this is actually where, you know, there's a lot of argument about whether or not Math 4, 5, and 5, 6 should be called compacted math. Technically, it's not compacted. It's more telescoping, but I think if you called it telescoped math, people would just get confused. So when we're talking about compacting, we might say something more along the lines of, we introduce a topic, we give a quick definition, and then we go straight to the bulk of the work. And we don't give a lot of the breakdown instruction because we're compacting that initial instruction to give more kids more time on the deeper, more depth activities. So that they have more time to do activities that are in depth, or they have more time to do longer projects, but we're spending less time on like that nitty-gritty instructional time. Whereas when we telescope the curriculum, it's kind of like we're zooming in on the course of study and we spend less time in the full course than we typically would. So Math 4, 5, and 5, 6, we do all of fourth grade and part of fifth grade and fourth grade. So we've telescoped those two. And then fifth grade, we do the rest of fifth grade and all, if not most, if not all of sixth grade, also during that fifth grade year. So we've actually telescoped the courses down. Concurrent programming, some of our students, when they, especially if they go into our course accelerated for math and they go up to the next school and they're dual enrolled in different schools, but we tend to think more of our concurrent or dual enrollment with our students who are in college. An interesting point, if I haven't brought it up recently, actually, no, never mind. I'll get back to that a different week when we talk about partnerships. But just kind of some of the rules around working with high school students in college now. So all of these things are really telling us that we present material rapidly, that it goes through at a higher level. It might be more complex. It might be more information covered in general. All of it is about that, the speed and the more. So you're going to cover more ground and you're going to do it faster, or you're going to cover more ground in the same amount of time. But again, none of that type of acceleration requires a course level shift. What it does require is a teacher understanding how to do that, or a critical mass of students who are ready to move at that pace so that the needs of the students who need to be accelerated can be met. This, of course, is where sometimes we have some trickiness because, there are also people who, when we talk about going into these courses, we want to look at data. We want to make data-driven decisions. It's not to say necessarily that data is the be all and the end all, because we know that, we can play games with data like everything else. But this is often when we run into feelings where but my kid wants that. I want that for my child. And it's like, I'm sure, but if your child's not ready for it, it doesn't do them any good to move them faster. And I was actually talking with some folks in the math department today, and they were saying, when we accelerate kids who aren't ready for acceleration, they do okay, especially when the parents are like, infusing outside tutoring and they're infusing support. And there's all sorts of like things helping the student stay afloat in the faster level course. But as soon as something goes wrong, and inevitably at some time in 12 years of school, something's going to go wrong. If the kid was inappropriately accelerated, when they fall apart, they're going to fall apart. And there's not a whole lot of places for them to go once they have fallen apart. So we want to make sure that when we're making some of these decisions that we're thinking both short-term and long-term for our students. There are students who, if they are not accelerated, we are in danger of losing them academically. They completely check out of school. The number of families I talk to, especially second and third grade, where they're like, my child just hates school now. They don't want to go. They cry when they have to go because it's so boring. And every day is like, nails on a chalkboard for them. So you guys all know that, I think about half the people here know that expression, half of them I feel like I have to explain to what a chalkboard is. But how about dry erase markers on a squeaky whiteboard? It's grating. And it's really sad to have those conversations. And honestly, as a second grade parent, I have those conversations on a very frequent basis because my child loves her teacher, but she hates school. And she has hated school for a long time because she is so bored. And she even came home recently and said to me, Mommy, I just don't know how I'm going to be a scientist and an inventor when everything we do in school I can learn on a magic school bus. Now, not every child's going home and watching hours of magic school bus, I grant you, but it's important to know when we're talking about acceleration and enrichment because it is necessary for our kids and we will lose them if we don't keep it in mind. While we're on the subject, then talking about what is enrichment. And this is where it's important to know there's a difference between an enriching experience and academic enrichment because every learner deserves to have an enriching experience. School should be meaningful, it should be joyful, they should have an opportunity to learn in a way that is best for them, and they should have the opportunity to have it make sense in a meaningful way to them as a learner. But enrichment is when we are enriching the course material so that we are going to greater depth and breadth in the same amount of time as we would do typical instruction for students who are more typical learners. So this might be looking at a student saying, okay, we're talking about this. I've always tried to do non-English examples and it never goes very well. Let's try something with biology, right? So, let's say we're going into DNA and we're doing my God, I totally knew the name of them the other day. The squares with the probability squares, Punnett squares, right? No, somebody will tell me. But at any rate, so we're doing those squares, and our students are learning what it means and how all those different statistics work. But we might have a student who really they have a need to know more. They want to go more in depth. It's not just about, the probability based on those four squares, but rather maybe they want to look into how genetics plays a role in, see, now we're right on my depth too. But they really want to know more about how probability impacts DNA or impacts what students, how people are made up because of those probability and statistics. That would be an example of enrichment because a student might not need to sit there and do those little Punnett squares. Is it right yet? No, I don't know. Somebody put in the chat for me. Oh, I got it right. Yay. They might not need to sit there and do square after square after square after square. Now, I can tell you personally, I did square after square after square after square, so I don't have any idea what I did. But that wasn't a good experience for me, but it doesn't mean that it was the wrong experience. But I was not the kid who was going to go way off into depth and understand, the probability and statistics of DNA. But if we have a kid who wants to do that, let them. And how do you build that into what they're doing? Well, do they need to sit there and do 15 squares? Or can they do squares, talk about squares, and then maybe go and look up something and research something that it's more meaningful to them, where they can come back and explain to you as the teacher, this is why it's important in the real world, or this is why I have a blonde-haired child and nobody in my family has blonde hair. Um, Learning kind of little things like that where it's something that's meaningful to them. Um, I think history is often the great example here, especially when we're talking something like humanities. Humanities is such a wide range of learning. It's why our enriched course in middle school is a humanities class because um, because the humanities is very broad. We could be talking about art, we could talk about literature, we could talk about culture, we could talk about military history. There's just so many pieces that make up the humanities. And so if we're talking about humanities in a historical context and we're talking about ancient Greece, you could have students who do more in-depth research about music and culture in Greece, or they could do more in-depth research about mythology and how it impacted politics. They could look into the literature or the art of the period and do that in-depth research on the area that's of interest to them, which allows them to have a better understanding of the overall time period. So that when we come back to, what makes classical Greek architecture or classical Greek anything still prevalent in modern day, everybody brings something a little bit different to the table, but we can have that same thematic conversation. And that's another way to bring in that enrichment is using thematic concepts to talk about a lot of different things. Because as you probably guessed from sometimes when I talk about things, like I can get really into some things and not all into other things, but I can still come to the party and I can have a decent discussion, even though like I know Euclidean geometry is something important that happened in Greece. Other than being able to say the words, I couldn't tell you much more about it. But if you're really into math and you want to study about math philosophers in that period, and I want to study about whatever I want to study about, we can still have a discussion about how it still continues to impact us today in terms of modern era. So when we talk about enrichment, specifically, that is what we are talking about. Um, and these are both definitions that I pulled from our MCPS Gifted and Talented policy. Another fun thing to know about the MCPS Gifted and Talented policy is that it was last updated in 1996. It was last updated before I started high school. It's been a minute, I'm just going to say. um, and that's an important thing to know because there's some really good pieces to it. I mean, if you look at the actual definition that we have, it's not terrible. But at the same time, so much has been learned in the last 30 years that, I think it's kind of a shame that we haven't updated this policy. We've tried. It's a thing. I don't want to get started on the recording, but we've done a lot of work to try and write a new policy that is more reflective of being the 2020s. We just haven't gotten there yet. But that also kind of goes to why some of our policies look the way they do, because it's been a hot minute since we updated them. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second so you guys don't get seasick while I look for whichever tab I want to talk about next. Not the right tab. Oh, you guys are about to meet Bella. Hi, Bella. You sit over here. Bella likes my keyboard. So I guess the next thing I wanted to talk about, like we said, I really want to get a little more into our best practices today. Um, so kind of having that idea of what is acceleration and what is instruction. Hopefully that works. Yay. I think you're seeing what I want you to see. It looks like you are. So talking about best practices. Um, so we talk a lot in Twice Exceptional, especially about strength-based instruction. We talk about it a lot in special education too, but we often come from different directions when we're talking about the strength-based instruction. So I'm also, this is one of those places I'm going to try and plug in some of the conversation about specially designed instruction, which is SDI, because it would not be a day unless you learned a new acronym, right? So I'm going to try and infuse some of it in here and kind of where it plays in and maybe a little bit of where it doesn't play in. But when we're talking about it, we also like visual metaphors because we're Twice Exceptional and that's what we do. So in this case, we're thinking about this as a plate. And what do we need on our plate for healthy instruction? So this is kind of the plate that we're going to look at today. that is our strength-based instruction. And the first thing we want to talk about a little bit is on interventions. And when we're using that strength-based approach, interventions need to be not just, they're not necessarily, they can be, but they're not necessarily specific interventions like a reading intervention, but it's rather us intervening in the process that is creating barriers for our learners. What is there and how are we intervening to remove those barriers for our students? It doesn't necessarily mean that we're ignoring weaknesses or that we're never teaching them to mitigate or work around their disabilities. We do acknowledge they have disabilities. That's part of the whole profile. But what are we doing to help them with that? They might need a direct intervention. You know, if they're struggling with reading, they might need a reading intervention. At the same time, if they're struggling with reading because their fluency isn't quite there yet, they don't necessarily need, you know, Orton Gillingham to sit there and go syllable by syllable. What they might need is something that reads to them while they're reading at the same time. So they have the fluency, they're hearing it, they're watching the words on the screen, but they're also able to answer the questions on those higher level texts because the fluency piece is being mitigated. So part of this intervention piece is really knowing your students and knowing what it is they need and why they need it and to what degree they need that support. The other part of our strength-based instruction, of course, is going to be that acceleration and enrichment. So we just talked about what the difference is for both of those. My philosophy for this personally is when, and I have it in bold on the screen, that I believe every child deserves to learn something new every day. If you go to school every single day and you never learn anything new, you are going to be miserable. And eventually you're going to make other people miserable because why not? You're bored and you need something to amuse yourself with. And our twice exceptional kids are way more likely, I don't have research on that, but I'll tell you, they are way more likely to entertain themselves by making other people miserable because that's what they do. If they're not making other people miserable, then they are completely zoned out. They are doing their own thing. They're not participating. They're all the non-compliant pieces that we look at, but often they're just showing us that they're bored because they're not learning anything. And so when we think about strengths first, the question kind of becomes, if this is their area of strength, they don't necessarily need that initial learning. They might need to clear up misconceptions. They might need a little more detail. But if this is truly a child's area of strength, introductory material is not going to instruct them. They're not going to learn anything new. So what can we do to look at what their strengths are and help them find that gateway into their learning? We also want to talk a little bit about the accommodations piece. And in this sense, special ed friends, accommodations, I do mean supplementary aids and services as well. The whole smorgasbord of what can we provide. And that's when we talk about this idea of leveling the playing field. And I know there's all sorts of graphics and memes out there. But we're really saying, what does the kid require in order to access the instruction? And then I like to take it to another level, which is, what does the student require that might make things easier for everybody in our class? And then looking next at, once we've made things easier or more accessible for everybody in our class, and easier doesn't mean that it's less rigorous or less content, but rather accessible. So once we've made things accessible for everybody, what do we need to do to specialize things more specifically for some of our learners? And this is really where the idea of the specifically designed instruction or specially designed instruction comes in. Specially designed instruction is a part of strength-based instruction because when we put all of our different frameworks together, it becomes an additional framework where we're saying, if we make everything universal design for learning, so we've made everything accessible, we can get to the curriculum, we can read the curriculum, we can write with the curriculum or talk with the curriculum, we can express ourselves within the curriculum. That's accessibility. The accommodations are, okay, you've given me all this accessibility, but I need something more. So it's like a thing. And it can be a tangible thing or an intangible thing. It could be extended time, but it also can be a read to accommodation. So it can be a variety of things. And then the specially designed instruction becomes the question of, if I've made everything universally accessible, then the specially designed instruction is how I'm teaching this particular thing differently for this child. And it could be I'm teaching it differently because I'm doing different problems. I'm presenting it in an even more, that's terrible English, but even a more different way. But it also could be my child needs social skills instruction in order to access the curriculum because they have no idea how to have a group discussion. And group discussion is really important, and student discourse is really important for this particular concept. So that's the specially designed instruction is looking at where their strengths are, but also looking at where their weaknesses are, and then designing the instruction to remove that specific barrier for that specific child so that they can participate in the instruction that they need. And then the last part is our case management. And I did put social emotional support here because social emotional instruction and social emotional support are different. And social emotional instruction is something that, we've talked about before, we'll probably talk about again, but it's something that we require, our students require across the board. It's a universal access piece. We know, especially coming out of the pandemic, a lot of our kids either did not get or lost a lot of social skills. So the need to teach it and put those pieces into the curriculum is there. What we're talking about with social emotional support specifically in this case, and again, this is not getting into social emotional support services, which is a whole different thing with special ed, but this is where the case managers and the teachers and the relationship building, and maybe that would be a better phrase to put here, but providing that individual management support and that social emotional safe place for our students so that they're able to access all of these things. Something that's very challenging with our twice exceptional kids is that they're very aware of their abilities and disabilities. What they often lack is the ability to bring those two together and be able to deal with the fact that they have both. And even somebody who is very well versed in it, who can talk through this, I can say, like, it's hard to say to yourself, you really should be able to do that, or all you have to do is get up and do something. When our kids are at school, that becomes our role really as a case manager frequently. We make sure the teachers know what they need to provide. We're in there co-teaching, we're doing all these things, but then we're also there telling our students, it's okay to access these things. It doesn't make you less of a learner to do this. Or when they become so frustrated that it feels like no accommodation, no support, anything is going to help, it really becomes that case manager who comes in and is the champion, is the cheerleader, doing all those little bits and pieces. And it's one of the reasons why we are staffed a little bit differently than some of our other programs, not as well as we used to be, and I wish we would return, but if wishes were fishes. But our case managers do have a different caseload because the amount of social emotional support that is needed to be provided to our twice exceptional students. We end up with our different classes and our different resource classes. The supports that they need tend to be a little bit different. And that's also why we do as much training as we do with the case managers. And we're finally starting to get funding again so that we can actually do our in-person learning with our case managers in the summertime. And I'm very excited for that. So just checking time, checking chat. Cool. So I want to take us into a little bit with differentiated instruction. And I will say, I do believe in differentiated instruction, but I also believe that it is currently one of the most loaded terms that people say it all the time without really knowing what it is. And it is the all-encompassing band-aid for everything that is right or wrong with education. So I'm a little emotionally perturbed with the term, but that doesn't mean it's not the right response. It means that I think as all educators, we're always here to learn and improve and better ourselves. And so I think it's important that we are able to talk about what's right about it, what's wrong about it, and what it really means and how it can actually provide impact in our situations. So I do love my cartoons. Um, teaching is like bowling. You just roll the ball down the middle and hope you touch most of your students. And a lot of times, honestly, that's also what differentiation feels like. So obviously, like when we first pulled this cartoon, we're like, oh, we're trying to say that you need to have a good hook shot, sweep the ends. Unfortunately, I feel like what differentiation has become is we're still trying to bowl down the middle. Um, Actually, I'll say it because I know it's not in my presentation. I did see a presentation once where they were talking about the Air Force and designing a cockpit for pilots. And this whole concept of, they have very, very tall pilots and they have very, very short pilots. And how do you design a seat that meets the needs of both? And they went through all of these different iterations of it. But what they found was there was nothing that they could find that would meet the needs of most of their pilots, whether they were tall, medium, or short. It just didn't, they were struggling with it. And what they ended up doing in the end is they designed for the extremes. They said, let's plan for the shortest and let's plan for the tallest. And then what do we have? What we have is an adjustable seat that the person who's very short can pull all the way up and the person who's very tall can pull all the way back. And then everybody else can find their spot in the middle. And then, of course, that technology turned into what we have in our cars today. And as somebody who's married to someone who's 6 feet tall, it is very nice at 5'4" to be able to move my seat around. Or even, I think almost a better example, my mom and I are the exact same height, but we still have to adjust the seats when we come in because I am mostly torso and she is mostly leg. And so I still have to pull the seat up even when my mom is in the car, but I have to also tip the mirror down because I'm too tall for it to see out of her mirror. All of that is to say that when we talk about differentiation, we're not saying, what we're saying is really we're being deliberate in our modifications. We are being deliberate in saying we're going to do multiple things or provide multiple avenues so that everybody in the classroom can have their needs met. I like this one, my little comics things, lots of different ways that we can use the comic, but it may not be perfect for everybody, but it's something that would be accessible. What we want to make sure that we don't think it is it is not a short order cook. We're not up there trying to do, everything for everybody. And this is also not our specially designed instruction either. Differentiation is about access. Specially designed instruction is about individual needs. Now, can we differentiate when we do our specialized instruction? We can. When we're looking at what that specialized instruction is, it could be specialized instruction for a small group. It doesn't have to be one-on-one. That's again where it comes into knowing what our students need, but knowing what our students need, but it's not asking everybody to customize every piece every single day. And to go back to our adjustable seat, which adjustable seats do we prefer? Do we like the one where we go click, 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 and it, has those little divots set into it? Or do we like the one where we've planned and we can roll it as much forward or backward as we need to, and sometimes up and down, and sometimes, I don't know about side to side, but we can at least put our back of our seat up and down. And honestly, cars become such a great vehicle for explanation. That was funny. I'm very tired because I thought that was hilarious. But, and you think about an adjustable mirror, adjustable windows, adjustable seats, adjustable steering wheels. There's so much customization available, and yet it's the same features for all of our different cars. And that's where when we start talking about some of these differentiation pieces, that's what we want to think of. How are we making it adjustable? How are we making it so that everybody is able to access what they need to access without us driving ourselves crazy as instructors. And then with our twice exceptional students specifically, this is also the opportunities where we think about, how are we accelerating the content, or how are we supporting the content? How are we putting in an intervention, or how are we putting in extra enrichment? How are we offering choice? How are we offering different types of strategies so that our students are able to access? And a lot of times, especially after this particular presentation, a lot of times the feedback I get is, well, that's just good instruction. Yeah, it is for sure. Sometimes the strategies themselves specifically are different when we talk about gifted or twice exceptional kids. But when you're talking about planning for your extremes, you are talking about good instruction because you're meeting everybody's needs by planning for the most extreme needs that you have within the classroom. Yes, productive struggle. So that is another awesome point, Katie. Universal design for learning and differentiation does not mean making it easy. It means making it meaningful. We want them to have productive struggle. We don't want them to spin their wheels. We want them to, have to find the handholds and climb up the mountain, but we don't want to cut the mountain down and let them walk up a little easy bit of a path. Then again, if your student is wow, I'm just all over metaphors today, aren't I? You know what? If your student's in a wheelchair, you might have to do an easier pass because they've got other struggles along the way, because eventually we're all trying to get to the top. So if we had that student in a wheelchair, helping them find handholds up a mountain is not going to be useful to them. They're not going to learn anything. They're just going to get frustrated. And so when we're thinking about that differentiation, and I know that sometimes when we talk about like all the options, it feels like I'm saying to you, you should offer all of these things. Absolutely. No, you shouldn't offer these things every single day. You should think about access every single day. You should think about support and scaffold every single day. But what you shouldn't do is force yourself into a three-ring circus where you're, providing it where it becomes a source of entertainment. It comes back to access. As I have a picture of an alien on here, because, I like this part also, though, because we're talking about, does it make our twice exceptional kids feel singled out? No. And it doesn't, because differentiation should be available to all of our students so that everybody can find that appropriate level of challenge. That said, our twice exceptional students will still feel singled out because they often live in a world of one. And so everything is about them. And if you're changing something to be accessible for them, it's because you're focusing in on them. Sometimes they need lessons in that, like, it's not all about you, and that's okay. Um, I don't like this slide. Y'all can look at this in there. I'm pretty sure this is in the what's that thing called? Slideshow on the website. Yeah, but I don't like the slide, so we're not going to talk about it. So, how do you figure out what it is that what your kids need? Well, we go into a lot of different places and we pull a lot of different data. And I'm not also saying that we need to do this for every kid every time, but we want to develop a profile, and we want to make sure our profile of each student, and again, develop a profile could be a mental profile where you just pull up ideas about a kid and you can talk about a kid, or it could be a type of child and you're just looking at types of kids in general, or you could be a paper pencil person who wants to have a file on each and every individual child. Power to you if that's what you want to do. And we don't have to do it all the time, but what we want to really keep in mind here is that we're pulling lots of information from lots of different sources. And one thing I don't have on, oh, I do have on here. Look at that. Asking other teachers. And I would say this, especially if you have a kid where everyone else dreads them, but you actually really like them. Or on the flip side, you absolutely dread them coming to your classroom, but yet other people don't seem to as much. Asking other teachers what they like about that child will help you find that thing. And it could just be that they just hate your subject. Sorry, not everybody loves everything all the time. And if you hate math, you might hate your math teacher. It has nothing to do with your math teacher. It's math. Sorry, math teachers. But then also having an opportunity or taking the opportunity to go and observe kids in other teachers' classes, especially if they are your problem children, to see, are they doing the same thing? Are they acting the same way? Are they expressing similar frustrations? Or are they doing a good job? Are they reaching out to that teacher more? Is there a better relationship there? I think sometimes that's one of the harder things to do because you're investing more time in a kid who stresses you out. But then I think the what you get back from it, because you see them in a different light and a different perspective, can make a huge difference. I do love all of these. This actually used to be my one on homework. I can't tell you why I didn't do my homework, but I've mapped out all the reasons why. I hate the way pre-assessment is set up in MCPS. I know I'm recording. I'm just going to put it out there. I say it all the time. And I hate the way that pre-assessment is set up in MCPS, especially for elementary, because what our pre-assessments ask is, are you prepared to start this content. What they don't ask is, have you already mastered this content? So if we go back to this idea of every child deserves to learn something new every day, well, how do I know if I'm going to teach them something new if I haven't asked them what they already know? And I will say, especially my first 2 years, I was in the Bridge program. I love teaching in Bridge. I taught English 6, 7, 8, and there were a couple times where I gave a pre-assessment and the kids actually got all the answers right. And I didn't know what the hell to do because I had everything mapped in my brain of like, this is what we're going to do. And then I was kind of at a loss. And I reached out, and sometimes people are like, well, then why are you pre-assessing them if they already know? Like, no, you missed my question, you missed my point. I don't want to sit there and teach them what they already know. Um, but having more experience now, knowing that I could go for more depth, I could go for more rigor, I could pull in more interesting things. At the same time, if I don't pre-assess and I assume that they know these things, I'm going to end up with some kids who are absolutely lost. And those were some hard times too. You have a class of 7 or 8 kids, and 4 of them ace your pre-assessment and 4 of them utterly fail your pre-assessment. None of them are grades because it's a pre-assessment. I'm not grading it, but like, what do I do and how do I manage that? It can be really difficult, especially in a smaller class. Um, but really what we want to look at when we're assessing is, what do they know? What are they ready for? Where are their interests? And what are those areas of strengths and weaknesses? Um, so yeah, I'm going to pull these things out. So when we look at our pre-assessments, we're looking for, I know they both say mastery, but there are 2 different types of mastery on here. So yes, we want to know if the kids have those skills. I guess I should take it back. I don't hate the NCPS pre-assessments. I hate that they are limited. I hate that they only ask us if the kids are prepared. They don't ask us the rest of these questions. But that is when we get into mastery. Have they mastered the new content? Or do they master the content but not the skills? Or have they mastered the skills but not the content? Those are very different things. And we want our kids to develop both. And that, again, can be a real challenge if they've done one or the other. And so you're having to balance, how am I teaching them the skills they don't know? Or if they already know the skills, how do I get the content piece in there? Is this a good time for enrichment? Are we ready to accelerate them? Do they have enough foundational knowledge that they're ready to progress to something else? And then also, what are their areas of weakness? So that goes back to that preparation piece. If they're not prepared, is it because they need a little more foundational skill knowledge, or do they need significant skills or significant content to get themselves to where they are? So we want to look for all of these things in pre-assessments. Do we pre-assess every day? Ideally, but we don't have to. But we do want to, going into units, going into, large shifts in content. So one of the strategies I really like, I saw in a presentation last year. It was really cool actually. We had a grant from the state and we were able to hear some really amazing speakers. And one of the ones that I liked the best, they had a ton of great ideas, but me throwing 1,000 ideas at you is going to make you sick. So we're going to stick to some of the easier ones. So I love the TWH chart because we know, do I have a sample? I do not. So we know the KWL, right? What do you know? What do you want to know? And then what did you learn? The problem with the KWL is, one, it expects that you go back at the end to learn, which I don't know about you, but I have never returned to a KWL. So it's usually just KW. And the L just kind of bye-bye. But the other thing is, if you don't know anything, then how do you know what you want to learn? Or if you think you know everything about something, then how do you know what else there is to learn? So we go to the TWH chart. What do you think you know about this topic? What do you want to know? So it's still a want to know, but it's framed differently because I'm not asking what you already know. I'm asking what you think you know, which as a teacher gives me an idea of kind of what direction we might be going, or if there's misconceptions, if you guys have really solid knowledge. And then the how do you want to learn? So it's kind of asking me, like, what's your readiness for this type of learning? What type of learning do you like to do? So some of the examples I've seen on this are, if I said, for example, we're going to talk about dinosaurs. what do you think you know about dinosaurs? What do you want to know about dinosaurs? And then how do you want to learn? So if I ask you guys all that question, in fact, I could, like, we could put it in the chat. Like, what do you think you know about dinosaurs? Well, some of you guys are going to tell me like what the root word for like where dinosaurs came from. Some of you guys might tell me about the different periods of dinosaurs. Some of you might inform me that, they're not truly lizards, they're more closely related to birds. If any of us are going to get into the difference between a flying lizard versus a pterodactyl versus a bird, then that's a whole nother conversation you can go talk to my daughter about. But the point is, when I ask that question to you, as a teacher, what I'm going to be able to do is go, they've never heard of dinosaurs before. They know a lot about dinosaurs, and that one needs to do a project on a special kind of dinosaur because there's probably not a whole lot I can teach them, but maybe we should have them focus on dinosaurs of the Jurassic period because they seem to know a lot about the Cretaceous period. Then what do you want to know? Well, again, if you have very, more simplistic things, you might have more simplistic, what do I want to know? I want to know more about what they eat. I want to know different names. And then you're going to have the one who goes, I want to know if they really were covered in feathers or if they were actually covered in scales, and how do we know that they're warm-blooded? Okay, well, I also now know what you need to know a little bit differently. And then we get into the how. Do you want to learn through videos? Do you want to learn through lecture? Do you want books? Do you want to be able to create a diorama of dinosaurs eating each other because you think that would be really cool? Asking how you want to gain that knowledge, asking a student how they want to gain that knowledge helps me understand how they learn. It helps me prep for them better. So when we get back again to differentiation, it's not me having to come up with 1,000 different ideas for 1,000 different kids. It's me being able to look at what they tell me and maybe categorize them. These guys really want multimedia. These guys really want more discussion based, stand and deliver a little bit. So again, I might not do all of those every day, but I know these are the types of instruction I need to build in because this is going to start hitting the needs of multiple students. So that's my favorite kind of pre-assessment. There's a ton of different ones out there, but that's where we're at. I think it's 7:53. So what I'm thinking is let's take our break now before we get into the low prep and high prep differentiation topics. So let's plan to be back at 8:05, and we'll start with low prep differentiation. We'll go into the high prep differentiation. And then if there is time left, I really want to show you guys a new lesson plan concept that it's new enough that it is not, I don't think it's actually published yet. It's being published soon. It's been presented at several conferences. And I really would like to show that to you guys because I do have some lesson plan models up, especially for the final project, but I'll talk about it more later. So let's take our break now. We'll be back at 8:05. So you get 11 minutes today. And I will see y'all then. I'm gonna start our recording again. And looks like you're looking at what I want you to look at. So awesome. So like I was saying before, differentiation is an important part of instruction. It's not all of it. But I do want to give you guys some strategies that will help. So the first thing we're going to run through are some low prep strategies. And a lot of these are interactive websites that you can use. So we're going to go through those, and then we'll talk a little more about some of the more intensive differentiation. So this is one of my, I have a couple like this that some of my favorites. What I really like with this one is that it allows, it's either something that you can do with the students, or it's something that you can have them do individually in small groups. You can give them some, guidance. You could give them some, I'm going to pick the blue, but you're going to pick the red, whatever it is you want. So I'm going to go out to the website. And so yeah, we have this example here. Students will judge the ethics of blank using a textbook, create an essay in a group of 3. So again, this is somewhere where you might, want them to judge the ethics of whatever it is they're talking about. I don't think any of us own textbooks anymore, so maybe I'm going to go and say, using a journal. And I don't think we all do essays. The essays are kind of boring anyway. So let's go look at some other product offers we might have. And I like how they set up visual construction. So it gives us that like more kinesthetic piece for our multimedia kids, writing, because we do like, some of us do like to write. Um, but it gives you different ideas. I also like the little caveat here, how they're thinking. Products are overemphasized. A cool looking product does not mean there was a high level of thinking. So I kind of like that. I also like that it also has the add a product option. So in case you wanted to do multiple, an essay or a newspaper or an illustrated book or a model or a drawing. So again, it gives us that opportunity to really do things for our students. Um, it's a cool tool to use. Oh, I did it again, didn't I? I think I would have learned after all the times I did my presentation. So this is Respondo. And again, oh, JK. So this one is more for literature. The last one you saw you could use in multiple different subject areas. This one really is more for literature. And we're talking about these Scamper skills. So Scamper is substitute, combine, adapt, minimize, maximize, eliminate, or rearrange. So it's really having them do something with usually one or more material pieces where we're asking them to think about it in a different way. And again, I think this is a great one where we can hand this to the students or to a group of students and say, you know, you're going to pick your two stories, you're going to pick your two content areas, and I need you to look at, are we studying conflict? Are we studying setting? Um, how they're going to show what it is they're knowing, um, and then also multiple product ideas. And you don't have to use this for, you don't have to use every single one of these. You can use just pieces of them. But like I said, what I like again is that there's the opportunity for you to have control. There's the opportunity for your students to have some control, or there's an opportunity to share control where you're giving them some givens and then they have the opportunity to pick different ways that they want to show what it is they're learning. Um, and then the other cool thing I think is if you give them access to the site and it doesn't really take you anywhere else, which is cool. Um, you know, I know one of the things that I always struggle with some of the differentiation is that I have too many ideas and I get very overwhelmed. And if I'm trying to think of things for a lot of different kids to do, I will easily fall down that product over performance hole. What I like about this is that it does limit, and even with the differentiator, it still limits us, you know, and I can tell the students like you have to, you know, analyze and synthesize, or you can do everything except remember because I'm going to hand you the list so you don't need to make a list. So it kind of gives us a lot more opportunity, but it doesn't make us scramble around to pick all the different things. Let's try and think about something. Oh, we have other prompts here too. Here's my presentation. The next one to look at is the PACE model. And the PACE model, I think, is really cool because it's like all of our acronyms, it's the same thing every time. And like a lot of the different strategies that we use, it's something that you can apply to multiple different settings. So the example that I've always been given is the Ruby Bridges painting. And you know, we can say it is provocative, it is ambiguous, there's a lot going on in here. There's a lot of complexity to the picture. There's complexity to the to the context, and it is an emotionally engaging piece. And so what we would do with the PACE model is we use it to select something, but then we also would go through this to discuss it. So what about this is provocative? What about it is ambiguous? Why do you think it's ambiguous? You could really hit hard on one of these, or you can hit um, all four of the different areas. You can also, you know, I picked a very provocative painting, and like I said, it's the one that was presented to me, and it hits all the spots. But you could put out multiple pictures and have the students go through a PACE model with different options. You can use this for text. You could use this for things in historical context, contemporary context. There's a lot of different things you can do to have discussion or generate discussion. And you can also use it for the students to look at this and, what are provocative questions we could ask about this, and have them write questions based on the PACE model, not just answer those questions. The art of questioning, and we will go into that, is a really important part of working with gifted and twice exceptional kids, because they will ask you a zillion and one questions, but it's super helpful to also teach them how to ask more complex questions. Oh, all right, give me 1 minute. And nope, I think it's this one. I swear I have it. Aha. So same person actually who took us through the KWL chart, are doing it as a TWH chart. I really liked some of the stuff they were talking about with the Venn diagrams, and the idea of how we can use multiple circles, different circles, as a method of differentiation. And we can use it as a building block. We can use it as a tool. We can use it to simplify thinking or complicate thinking. So we have our 1 circle, 2 circles, 3 circles we're used to. The one that I thought was the coolest was this idea here of the triple circle, or quadruple circle rather. And the way this one works is you've got all of these different overlaps, and then for these two, which this one here and this one here that don't overlap each other, you have the bottom ones here to overlap. This is super confusing. I think I was hoping I had the sample of it. When your planning doesn't go quite right. Grand. So the way the presenter described this was she used a discussion about Harry Potter as the example. And so our first one was maybe each person in a group would get 1 oval. And we're going to talk about who has similar and different characteristics of all the different Harry Potter characters. So let's say one has Harry Potter, one has Ron, one has Hermione, one has Voldemort, and we're going to go from there. And so you might get your circle and just talk about your one character. And then I might get together and I might do, having like the different corners or different parts of the room where you take your circle and you meet with somebody else who has a different circle, and we do a Venn diagram together. How is Harry Potter like Hermione? Where are they different? Where are they the same? And I could go around and do matching, different discussions. And then this one, we get together in our groups of 3 and have that discussion. And then we have this last one where we might get 4 people together and have a discussion. Or, you have 2 people come together and come up with all of those pieces themselves. Or you might have some students that are really good here, and this is as complex as they need to go. And then you might have other kids who just blast through this, and they really do need the time to sit here and say, well, if we had Dumbledore, Harry Potter, Hermione, and Voldemort, how do we find commonalities among all of those different ones? How do you fill in the center block where all 4 of them overlap? And it becomes a really enriching discussion. You can do it as a whole class where you're filling it in and having almost a debate about what characteristics might go where. You can use this in other subjects as well. As I said, I'm not always the best on speaking on other subjects, but I've seen people do it with like addition and subtraction. And then you do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. If we're at a point where, you're first teaching addition to your first graders and you've got a first grader who's ready for multiplication, have them look at that in a 3 oval setting. Well, let's look at multiplication, subtraction, and addition and figure out what's same, what's different, because sometimes that will also work in terms of being a pre-assessment, because if they get it really quickly, they're ready to move on. If they really, they find commonalities here and here, but they're struggling to make other connections, it gives you an idea of where their next instruction needs to be. So Venn diagrams do not have to be boring, even though my slide there is very boring. So like I said, questions. I really like this quote. Most teachers waste their time by asking questions which are intended to discover what a pupil does not know, whereas the true art of questioning has for its purpose to discover what the pupil knows or is capable of knowing. And I really like this because we learn so much by what our students ask us. We learn where their interests are. We learn their disinterests. Um, Lower level questions have their purpose. We do sometimes actually need to know what it is that they do or don't know. So I'm not saying never ask those questions, but when we're posing questions to the class or when we're posing questions for discussion, we really want one to pose questions that encourage the students' critical thinking, but to me, more importantly, we want to teach them how to ask effective questions. So by using the effective questions and teaching them effective questioning, we are going to develop a deeper level of understanding for our students. So one thing we can do, and this is a teacher prep piece, is where we might ask leveled questions. So I have 3 questions here. You know, we might start with a really low level question. What are your feelings after reading the beginning of the book? Or the next one, return to a place in the story that you liked, disliked, or questioned, and how might it change, how did this event change your opinion or interpretation of the story? And then we have the last one, you know, what is the author trying to say about life and living through this novel? So really a thematic question there. Now, I've also had people point out to me that that first one, what are your thoughts or feelings after reading the book? Some kids get really freaked out about that personal or introspective piece. That might be a really difficult question for them. Knowing your students is important. Um, for some students, I see this a lot with our students with autism, especially, where that's a really, well, what does it matter? They don't connect with a question like that feeling piece. So sometimes I might say something like, well, how do you think this character might respond? Or, if you, and that goes back to like what we saw with Respondo, where, what would the giver be like if it were in a Wrinkle in Time setting? Okay, well, what would Meg think if you stuck her in the giver? So giving them other characters where they've learned some of the background of students or of other giving them questions where they have the personality of a character to place in another setting sometimes takes away some of that personalized piece. But the bigger part of this is the level of depth and complexity it takes for you to generate your questions or generate your answers. Question cubes are fun. Um, sometimes you just get this thing where like it's the easiest thing in the world and you can't figure it out. That was question cubes for me. It should not have been as hard to figure out as it was, but it was. But what I liked was a lot of this is about the students generating the questions. So, but again, you don't want to give them that totally carte blanche because you'll either end up with things that are not as helpful as they could be, or you might end up with like that freeze where like, I have no idea what to say. So I like the question cubes because they ask, you might again give them the topics, but you're rolling the question. So, how are whole numbers and fractions similar? Maybe I roll, how are they different? Maybe I'm rolling, what lessons did we learn from the revolution, or what should we have learned in the Revolutionary War that we didn't manage to learn until 1812? You can use them in different contexts with different ideas. And again, it's a way for them to generate or to develop discussion. So if you're trying to have a group discussion and they're struggling, giving them question cubes to roll can be a helpful way to move that discussion forward. Really? All right. Well, the level of questions clearly liked being here because they came back. Um, I love the question matrix, and I love the question matrix for a bunch of different reasons. One, I like charts. I like arrows. I like that it gives you a lot of different areas to go to. But what I also, sometimes I outsmart myself. One of the things I really like with this is using it also with like numbers or points. So if you do, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever points all the way down, and then you do the same thing this way, you can add another level of complexity by telling students you can't ask questions that are worth fewer than 3 points. You can't ask questions that are worth, you can only ask one question that's worth more than 10 points. Or you might say to them, you know what, I'm giving you 30 points to spend. How many questions can you come up with? How few questions can you come up with and spending all your points? And I found that it was really important to give some of those parameters because I don't want a whole bunch of who didn't go to the, like, those are really simple questions, right? But you also can get really overwhelmed by like, how didn't this make the character feel? You know, like there's a little more depth to that, but sometimes the kids try to be so complex that they aren't as complex as they think they are, even though they're using the higher areas of complexity. And then also it gives you more variety of questions. If you give them parameters, you know, you have to spend this many points or you can't do more than this, that, or the other. It forces them to generate better questions because they have to pay attention to those parameters as well as the content that they're focusing on. And then also when you're drawing kids in, like, you know, your math kids might not love literature, but they really like numbers. And so they're, you know, keeping track of the points and trying to be creative with how they're using those numbers. Um, and I have seen this done outside, you know, with, again, you might need to do some tweaking, but, you know, the who, if you're talking about numbers, well, who, which number can't, you know, go in these certain spots, which symbol can't provide this type of answer. So you can use them in areas other than English, even though 90% of my examples are in English. And then the varying individual response cards as well. This one takes a little more prep work, because, but again, you're not doing it necessarily for every individual student, but maybe you have 3 different exit cards and, you know, you're walking around and you just pass out your exit cards to your students and you know which ones to give. You could also have students say, you know, have 3 different colors up there. You know, if you really feel like you got this, you should probably answer the blue card. If you feel like you're struggling with this, pick up the question on the yellow card. And if you're not sure where you're at, go ahead and pick up the question on the green card and give me your best answer. So I know that I've differentiated my questions based on understanding, and then regardless of the type of answer or the one they choose, I can look at the depth and complexity of the responses they give me. So again, it gives you that option of, you know, for students with multiple ranges in your class and controlling who gets what, but it also gives you a chance, like, regardless of my question, I could put the same question on all 3 cards. And I know how you're feeling about the subject by the color you picked up, even though your question is essentially the same. So it's a way to get feedback from the students, to get thinking from the students, but also giving them those areas of control. And then for your really, you know, probably twice exceptional student, you can have a blank card there. Well, how about you write an exit card question and then you answer it for me? So we're going to go into high prep. I love me some high prep tasks. They're high prep for a reason. So these are not ones that you're necessarily doing every day. And a lot of the high prep tasks also mean high prep or high output responses. So they're not ones that you can necessarily prep in a day and do in a day. Some of them are, but a bunch of them aren't. So the raft, I love a raft. Again, like I struggled to understand this in the beginning. I don't know why, because it's not that hard of a concept. But then I was in charge of teaching it to my graduate class. So then I had to actually learn what it was. And I actually really enjoyed it once I figured it out. And so the raft is really asking about taking perspectives of who you are as a presenting person, who you're speaking to, how you're going to do what you're doing, and then, of course, the topic that you're writing on. So I have a bunch of example rafts here, and this one I love because I went to other subject area people and made them write rafts for me. So I love the math examples here. So you're the role of the 0. You're trying to talk to whole numbers. It's campaign speech because you want whole numbers to believe that you are an important part of their existence. Or we have parts of a graph and we're talking to a TV audience. We're going to write a script on how to read a graph. So it has that creative piece to it. And it's making the kids think about those concepts in a different way. You can see some of these are, and most of these actually in here are written examples, but you do have, like, you know, the petition. So like, how could you be creative with a petition? Coming up with that tip sheet on like what are quick ways to calculate percentages. They could do that in terms of primarily mathematical formulas, like quick way to calculate tips. Our social studies one, I did actually pull this, or have my social studies friends write some of these. So I love Death of a Confederate Soldier. writing to Robert E. Lee a complaint about Pickett's charge. Well, I can imagine if I died, I'm probably not pretty happy about it. But like, how can I express why I'm not happy about it? Um, I like the Great Wall of China, writing to myself as a diary about all the invaders I have stopped because I'm just so fabulous. Um, so it really becomes that creative piece, but they're also showing that knowledge. These rafts, these could be done in a day. And the nice thing is that once you kind of get the feel of them, they're not quite as high prep. The hardest part, I think, and obviously these are covering a whole bunch of different topic areas. So, if we're only doing like the Civil War and having multiple options for the Civil War, it can take a little time, especially when you're first writing them, and then also coming up with the rubric on how you're scoring them. To me, one of the important things with a raft is writing a rubric where you can score essentially everything on the same rubric. So we're really, did you capture the role that you were supposed to play? Did you address the appropriate audience? Did you follow the format? And were you accurate on your topic? Is usually the quickest way to do that. But again, some kids are going to need some more direction on that rubric. So being um, being flexible with it. So I always share this one. This is the raft that I wrote when I was teaching the Odyssey. And if you are not familiar with the Odyssey, the first four books of the Odyssey can be pretty much summed up in like all the people who are miserable because Odysseus isn't there. And so we run through these pretty quickly when we were teaching them. And so this one we're talking about his wife Penelope being home alone by herself. They're dealing with all these suitors. His son Telemachus is dealing with the suitors, and then the suitors themselves who are trying to steal away Penelope. And what I liked about this was that one, we really tried to have things, and we had more choices. These were the ones I liked the best. Um, I got some amazing threats written. I got some amazing horrible poems written. Um, like the awkward love poem. The kids were hilarious, and just getting to see some of that. And so some of these things, like they understood the relationship between Penelope and the suitors, and the fact that, like, yeah, this is a married lady that we're writing a poem to. But what we got out of them was like vocabulary and creative thinking and just kind of seeing like how silly they could be, and giving them that time to get into a really difficult text. I'm not saying this is the highest level of thinking, but it was the highest level of creativity. The single ladies playlist, hearing the kids, like we told them they had to give us reasons. You couldn't just give me a song. You had to tell me why that song was on the playlist and like convince me I wanted to hear the song. I had kids who actually made playlists for us, and I had kids who actually made playlists for us. I had one kid who like made their own like CD cover, even though this was like not in CD days, but they knew what a CD cover was. They made a CD cover, they decorated it. It was just this opportunity to express beyond what we even asked them for. And I loved being able to bring that to them in an otherwise really kind of heavy, dense text. Um, I usually let them make their own. And then, like, so for this particular one, when I taught it, I think we had 8 options and they had to do 3 of them. Some years I would do like, I would give them point values. So again, like you need to come up with 25 points. You can do a 25-point option, or you can do 3 5-point options, except that's only 15 points. So, you have to play with it a little bit. Um, but I definitely let them pick. If I felt really strong about something, like I might tell them, you can't do all Penelope. Like you have to take on other people's perspectives. And then, or I might tell them, pick 2 perspectives minimum and give them some guidance. But I really wanted it to be as open-ended as possible because, especially for something like this, like I want to see your creative side. If you don't like what you're writing about, then it was a lot of work for nothing. Oh, here's our science raft. Um, oh yeah, the hibernation lullaby. Hey bears, it's time to go to sleep. Let me sing you a song. Um, the travel guide for the water drops going through the water cycle. And again, like you could do that with 10th graders, you could do that with little kids when they're first learning the water cycle. There's a lot of opportunities for creativity and for different things within the whole raft. So like I said, once I got into it, I love a raft. And then we have all these choices. So again, this should be up on the Canvas page. If it's not, remind me and I'll post it. I know I've been having some issues posting videos. I don't know why they keep going up and then they blank, but I'm working on it. So tic-tac-toe is a more classic one, but again, I think one of the things that's nice about this is you can offer a whole lot of different ways to show knowledge and show understanding. And you can do it where you pick one box, or everybody has to do the center block, but then you can do whatever you want to make your tic-tac-toe. Um, I think one of the things that, especially for a tic-tac-toe board, that you can also have as a great like substitute teacher plan, because there's a lot of things in there where you could say, like, okay, so this one's about quadrilaterals, but thinking about what topics you're talking about in a unit, and then you just have to make minor adjustments to them while you are, so it still talks about what it is that you're doing, but it gives a creative opportunity for the students in the class that doesn't necessarily need a lot of front-loaded teaching um, from the teacher. Wow, that was redundant. Um, but again, I like this idea. You can also make them more complex where you only, it's more of a choice board than a tic-tac-toe board. Tic-tac-toe specifically is trying to get them to do 3 in a row in some way or another. I always like the choice menus idea. Again, this goes back to those point values where, you have to pick one from each category. You have to spend a certain amount of money. And then usually the easier ones are, or the lower level thinking tasks, like on Bloom's kind of thing, would be your apps. Your entrees are going to be the more intensive pieces, and the desserts tend to be the funny things or a little bit more creative, um, trying to kind of just help them move through into a different type of thinking. And then this is also a good time to talk about how you can do some of your modification or differentiation for your students where maybe they really can't because of extended time or whatever. Having them do that many things is too much. So, you know what, in a way of modifying it differently, maybe everybody in the class has to do a $15 menu, but for my kids with extended time, I'm only going to have them do a $10 menu. So, and I could do that by just passing out Monopoly money or passing out index cards with, this is how much you have to spend on there. I could tell some kids, you know what, don't even worry about sides, focus on apps and apps and entrees, and spend your money and do what you need to do. So it allows you to have some of that flexibility without, again, having to, like, coming up with the menu itself can be complex and takes time, but the different things you can do with it to adjust for your specific students' needs, I think is really important. The other thing you could do when you have something like this choice menu is you could have the entree be the focus of the work, and then the apps might be being able to maybe use an app to learn a little bit more about the topic. Maybe a dessert or a side would be, to request a small group with the teacher and, like, hey, I'm going to pull you guys from some additional direct instruction, but that's going to be $3 towards your final product so that you don't have to do all of the different work, but rather you're going to get differentiated instruction from me, while somebody else might want just to do that entree because they're more advanced, they need more enrichment, they're doing other things. So you really could use it as a way to structure your class as well. And that is true for some of them, not all of them, obviously, but it's, again, a way to manage having the kids have choice, having them feel a part of it, but then you also being able to manage what your expectations are and what they are able to do or not able to do. So these I see a lot in different classes, and we must do can do's or imperatives, negotiables, options. Um, Again, it depends on the purpose. Like sometimes when we do must do, can do, it's our kids are like struggling to participate at all. And it's like, well, you have to do this at some point today, but here's some other things you can do as well. But this one, again, it's kind of like forcing everyone to choose the center on the tic-tac-toe board and then getting to pick whatever else. So kind of the idea of, like, the chemical problem is your imperative. You have to pick a chemical problem. You have to tell me why it's important. Um, you have to give me a map to show where this is impacting. You have to have a talking points for a paper. But you could talk about either approximate cost of the problem or talk about evolution of the problem, like how you're going to approach it. Are you going to be forward thinking, or are you going to be retro thinking and kind of looking at that in that long run? Again, for students, a student who's a more concrete thinker might prefer to do a historical timeline. You might push them, you know, think about how we've gotten here over 100 years. Your students, especially I would say your ADHD students, they are really big picture thinkers. Their brains work big to small. So saying like, you know what it is, so let's think big. Where could this go? Where do we want it to go? How could we look at all these different areas? You might not need to know all the details for the different areas, but at least be able to talk about how all these pieces come together. So again, it's a way to think about what the kids' needs are. You know, if they need something very concrete, if they need something more abstract, if they need something that is, you know, lots of big ideas versus itty bitty details. There's a lot of different ways that we can help bring those pieces together. And then the options, again, this is a bit more on the projecty side, but this is where we're doing our bringing in that creative element. And when we talk about gifted instruction and twice exceptional instruction, creativity is a huge part of it, because if they aren't able to express themselves in a creative way, and creative could be writing a paper, they might be very strong writers and actually want to do some writing, but giving them the options to show where their creativity is, I think is one of the most important parts when it comes to gifted and twice exceptional instruction, because if they can't show their creativity, they're not going to participate, because at that point it's rote and they don't care. And we all know if they don't care, they're going to find something instead. So again, these ones are 3 different options, but we're showing, you know, we have one that is very concrete, very fact-based. We have one, yes, side quests, I like that. You know, this one's the fictionalized account, so we're bringing in some of that more creative, like nonfiction literature writing, and then the one that's much more of the cartoon, but like cartoon drawing can be very complex thinking, depending on what it is our students want to do. And then we also have our anchor activities. I love me some anchor activities. Um, Anchor activities are great for, they're great for a lot of things. A lot of times we think of an anchor activity as an end piece, like you finished early, you're going to go do this. But, you know, what if you have that kid who's just spinning and they don't know what it is that they want to do with the project? Give them something that's on topic, but maybe not on task. It's a different task to look at. It is good when, you know, if we're going to do group work or pulling small groups for instruction and kids just need something to do to put their hands on, it's something that's available. And again, it gives them a different way to interact with the content. I also really like, and I've seen and heard from with teachers where a lot of times we get this idea that these are the fun activities that you do when your work is done. And so the kids who struggle to get their work done never get to the fun activities. But there's no reason if they're not, as long as they're built into what it is you're teaching, why not take the group of kids who feels like they get left out and give them the anchor activity to start? Get them to do the creative piece first to kind of solidify their understanding of the topic, so that when they get into the harder work, or the work that they're struggling with, they have a solid concept and a creative concept that's kind of built into their brains. But I do love that different idea of like the anchor activity is not, you know, it's not an ending activity. It's the thing that's supposed to kind of ground everyone together on what it is we're doing. So these are some anchor activities that I had written for, and yes, they're English. I'm sorry, they're going to be English. But I really liked this one specifically because I was bringing in a bunch of different pieces. Um, I was actually teaching this as a credit recovery class. And so my students in credit recovery, a lot of different reasons, a lot of different things. I had some students who had just failed the class. I had some students who were returning from maternity leave or about to go on maternity leave, and they needed something to help them access different things. Like they were bringing so much to the table that I had to have, because they would come in and out of my class at any given time. And for me, if you're taking the time to come to a credit recovery class, I'm going to do everything to make sure that you have that credit. So definitely a different perspective on these activities, but I still think that they are, um, I still think they kind of show what we can do with them. So specifically, we are teaching the house on Mango Street. And one thing I did was I pulled back to this short story 11. And I love the story for a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons is that honestly, we use it, actually, Katie, you probably know, I think we use it in like 4th or 5th grade now. Um, I know it's somewhere in ELC. I don't remember where exactly, but it's a much easier to understand story. There's not a lot of complex language. There is a lot of complex thinking. And so comparing the specific chapters that I have them look at from House on Mango Street with 11 gave them a way to do some of that participation. It's a short story. They're very short chapters, and it allows them to look at language in a way that doesn't necessarily require a lot of teacher direction. This class specifically, I had a lot of students who it's this weird, bizarre thing about when students are in like ESOL level classes and then also need to get an English language credit. At some point, their EML class doesn't count for that credit. So a lot of them are taking this credit recovery class simply because of the way their English language development classes were working out. I hope they fixed it since I left, but that's what it was at the time. And so what I actually had them do was I pulled the book in Spanish. And I had my students who were native Spanish speakers or who were in advanced Spanish classes and felt like they could handle the activity, read a chapter in English and then also the chapter in Spanish and then do something with it. And I really loved what we got out of this because what I ended up doing was almost the whole class did this. And I really loved that one, I learned that the the official House on Mango Street in Spanish is translated, not or I get this right. It is translated in that it is written with Spanish words the way we write in English. So obviously when we go from one language, I like that face right there. So when we go from one language to another, we all know that like the flow is different, the words are different, the syntax is different. I don't know if this is true of all books, and I found it fascinating that this is true of House on Mango Street, which is written by a Mexican American author. She did not translate her own book, it was translated by somebody else. And one of the most interesting sentences is in the very first one. The girl says, "My name is Esperanza," which in Spanish means hope, except in the Spanish version it says, "My name is Esperanza," which in Spanish means Esperanza. And so, you know, you kind of lose a little bit of meaning there. But then also discovering from my different students about how different the translation was versus how they might say it in their own home dialect. And I learned a lot about a lot of different Spanish words based on like, we would never say that, or that actually, yes, technically that's right, but that actually kind of means something rude or inappropriate where I come from. And just the dialogue that came out of it, I think was amazing. And again, it started as an anchor activity, but it turned into a really important part of our classroom, which I appreciated. And then here is the raft. Oh yeah, I did have them write book reviews and I gave them a couple of Amazon ones so they could write a book review for me on how they felt about the topic. So again, in this case, all of them were reviewing the book, but we were reviewing them for different audiences, or they were going to take on a different role other than themselves. So again, I controlled what it was that I wanted them to do, which was tell me whether or not they liked the book. But by giving them all of these kind of different mediums, it gave them a way to express themselves. And then one piece that's not on here, I actually, oh, I actually had them read somebody else's review and comment on that. And that was an option I gave them as well if they weren't quite sure where to start. So the last thing I'm going to go over, nope, 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 nope. Aha. So trying to see, make sure you guys can actually see this. So one of the things that I do, one of my side quests, side projects, I don't know. I think it's mostly very clear that I love the world of twice exceptionality. I live it, I'm one of them. It is not only my home life, it's my work life, but it's also a lot of my volunteer life. I'm very involved with a lot of national groups. I chair for the National Association for Gifted Children. I chair the Twice Exceptional Special Interest Group. I also sit on the Special Populations Executive Board, mostly because I'm also the chair for the group. But I do a lot of work on the national level. I go to a lot of conferences to present about twice exceptionality. And one of the awesome things about that is that one, as messed up as things feel like they are sometimes around here, we are still one of the leading organizations in the country working with twice exceptional kids. And what we provide and offer for twice exceptional kids is amazing. And sometimes I need that perspective because, when it's your everyday life, you feel like nothing's ever going right and everybody hates you. And then you go out there and everyone's like, you're MCPS. Can we talk about, like, it's refreshing, honestly. The other thing I appreciate about it is that the bonds that I've been able to make over the years have brought a lot of things to MCPS and to our teachers, to our students, because part of being on the cutting edge means people want your opinion on things, because a lot of our researcher friends are just that, they're researchers and they try and get in the classrooms, but not a lot of them are teacher educators. They're up there, they're elsewhere. So one of my good friends, who's become a very, very good friend to me over the last couple of years, her name is Claire Hughes Lynch, Dr. Claire Hughes Lynch. Lynch Hughes, God, I'm tired. Claire Lynch Hughes. And Claire began a teacher education program for teaching twice exceptional students. So specifically, it's not just a special education degree where we happen to talk about twice exceptional students, and it's not just a gifted degree where we happen to talk about twice exceptional students, but it's actually a twice exceptional degree program where you get both special ed and gifted certification coming out of the program. And if you are interested in a master's or another master's, I'm happy to hook you up because it's an online program. But in all the conversation around this new program and some of the work that Claire is doing, one of the things that she and others came up with was this idea of how do we structure lesson planning that takes the best of both the special education and the gifted education world and bring them together in a way that is meaningful for twice exceptional students. Because right now out there, we either use special education and then we throw in some enrichment, or we use the enrichment models and we throw in the scaffolding, but we don't have anything formally out there that does both. So that's what Trellis and Bloom is. So Trellis and Bloom is this concept where we use the trellis as the foundational structure. So those would be our special education structures. And then we bloom with, or we add the nourishment, the nectar of the enrichment pieces to have our students bloom. You also see some bumblebees on here. There's a whole thing Claire does about why bumblebees are twice exceptional, and we can talk about that in a hot minute. But what I really wanted to show you, since we're really talking about instruction today, is how we can build these both at the same time in terms of a lesson plan in order to meet the needs of our twice exceptional kids. So what that ends up looking like is this lesson plan model. And I am happy. I actually have, I think, Claire doing a presentation on this from last summer. It's a little bit different because last summer I believe it was called the tomato plant model, and they have since changed it. And partly it was because same exact concepts, but all the artwork looked like we had tried to cage the tomato, and it was like now the kids are in cages. It wasn't working. So I love the Trellis and Bloom, and actually her co-researcher Debbie Troxler, Dr. Troxler, actually painted this picture. So it's kind of a fun piece to bring all together. But again, with this activity, very similar to a lot of our lesson plan styles, but what is our standard? What is our objective? And then in every piece that we do this, what is the primary activity or skill that we want to do, or content that we want to do? And then how do we have increase the difficulty? How do we increase the rigor? How do we increase the enrichment? And also, how do we increase the access? And by using this structure where we think about both things every time, the goal is ultimately we have a framework that is meant to address the needs of our twice exceptional kids, which will also be good for the other kids because we're meeting the needs of the gifted kids in the one category, our special education students or students who need access in another category, and we're thinking about both things simultaneously to meet the needs of our twice exceptional students. So one thing I will also put out there is that Claire and Debbie and Wendy Behrens is the other person who's on here. They are working on a book. because nobody's ever published a book for teachers of twice exceptional students. There's a lot of research out there. There's a lot of social emotional out there, but there is not teacher prep textbooks on like how to teach our kids. And so one thing Claire is looking for is lesson plans that were based on this model that have actually been taught that and taught successfully within the classroom. So one thing I am putting out there as if you have not thought about what you want your final project to be, one thing you could think about is writing a lesson plan using this model, and then also writing a reflection, kind of what went into your planning, but then a reflection on how things went, and how it specifically supported your gifted and twice exceptional students. And if this is something you choose to do as your final project, I am happy to pass it on to Claire and her team to review for consideration for her text. And I would also obviously put you in touch with Claire if that's the direction that you decide to go. Whether or not Claire picks you for the book has nothing to do with your grade for my class. But I really like it because one of the things that we have in there is something that's very similar to this, where I ask you to think of a twice exceptional kid you have, what their specific needs are, and then how do you flip a lesson plan to meet their needs, and then how can that translate to the class. So it's using the lens of one child to kind of open up the needs for all of the kids. But what I like about this specifically is that it's asking you to think in that broader lens from the start. So I think both of our approaches, I think both approaches are good. And if you're not at a place where you feel like you can do this model, that's perfectly fine as well. And you might also consider using the model I have in there where, like, I think that my example is my kid Sophie. And Sophie said I can talk about her, it's okay. So with Sophie, brilliant kid, but in 10th and 11th grade was still reading on a second, third grade level. And also, very interestingly, we discovered that because she had been in a French immersion program initially, her English made sense if you read it with a French accent and you assumed that somebody who was just learning English was the person who wrote it. But she was not a native French speaker, although she does speak French fluently. It was a very interesting situation. And so, and she also, again, brilliant kid, but she had a processing speed down about the first percentile. So you'd ask her something and it took her a hot, long minute to get there. But when she got there, oh my God. And then you throw in ADHD because that's just fun. I also love the fact that there's the same age difference between me and Sophie as there is between Sophie and my daughter, because her dad was my teacher when I was in high school. So we just have like a lot of little connections there. But at any rate, I digressed. So I used Sophie as my model, where I made a profile of Sophie and what were Sophie's needs. And I did this while I was actually doing my master's program, which is how I got my co-teacher to buy into it, is I needed to do it for homework. And she was very a fan of me doing my homework. So we did the model together for Sophie. And then we looked at an upcoming lesson for Sophie and we talked about how we would change it. And in the course of that conversation, my co-teacher was like, well, that would be kind of fun to do with everybody. Exactly. That was where we were going with it. And we actually ended up flipping how we did all of our vocabulary lessons for the next 2 years. And I think she still does a lot of what we kind of input. Obviously, her kids are different, so we had to make changes. But the more important part for that discussion was this is what Sophie had to have. It was her specially designed instruction, but it flipped into accessibility for our whole class. And I still had to do different things, for Sophie and for other kids along the way. But that's kind of where that model came from. If you're looking at doing the Trellis and Bloom, which is what I have on the screen, if you're looking at using this model, you could still use the lens piece that I have on there, and it's under whatever the first teacher option is. But instead of using the lesson planning tool I have on there, using this one instead, feel free to use it. But like I said, if you use it and you want to make this your project, I'd love to see how it goes because they are looking for it. And of course, being MCPS, they came to us first, asking for this feedback if we're interested. So if you want to know more about that, please feel free to reach out to me. I don't have this presentation up, because she just gave us this presentation last month. Yeah, literally. Sorry, I was just looking at that. Claire actually called into my case manager meeting and presented this to us last month. I have, like I said, something similar that I recorded her doing last year. So I will get those up there if they're not there already. But But if you want to know more about it, you guys have that link on my Canvas page to make an appointment with me. And otherwise, I know as teachers go, doing the instructional strategies is really like the big thing because that's, I think, what draws you guys in initially. But like I said, there was a method to the madness of giving you the background of what is our twice exceptional, who our twice exceptional kids are, so that as we talk about these strategies, it's grounded in who those learners are. I didn't see a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm happy to take them, and I'm also happy to not record questions if that's what you would prefer. But if anybody has any questions before I turn off the recording, feel free. Then I will stop the recording.